Joining us now is Jeet Heer. He's a Canadian journalist joining us from Canada. Jeet, how are you?
Very good. Good afternoon. Good to be here.
So happy to have you. So you have a recent piece in the New Republic, which is one of the only things that I read over my vacation, and it was a very, very good piece called "How to Make It in Conservative America If You Aren't White." There's a lot to this, and it brings us to some figures like Dinesh D'souza, who we'll get to soon, who, you know, even within the context of this show that we do, where we definitely sort of part of what we do is monitor conservative media. Even in that context, everybody's sort of like, hey, look, Dinesh, he's just this sort of racist clown. Why give him oxygen? And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But what your piece puts him in context and puts a much broader conversation in context. So by way of setting it up, just like you did in your article, how does your family background help you understand this relationship between the conservative movement and non-white people within the conservative movement?
Sure. Yeah, I was born in India, in the north of India, in the province of Punjab, and like all my family, at least my blood relations are there. Although I have other family members now who are like from Sri Lanka and Bulgaria, but so my background was growing up as an Indian immigrant in Canada, and one thing I sort of like noticed growing up was like there was kind of like a spectrum of attitudes among Indian immigrants towards racial issues, and particularly towards like sort of like Afro Canadians, and like I want to emphasize there is a spectrum. Like there's like people I grew up with, family members who are like very strongly anti-racist and sort of identify themselves as being non-white and as part of a larger coalition needed to challenge racism. But there's also like Indians. Immigrants that I sort of knew who took a kind of opposite tack, where like for them making it in Canada meant like differentiating themselves from groups that they considered like less successful, which includes both Black Canadians, but also actually in the Canadian context, Native Canadians, right? Like
right.
What are also ironically called Indians, but like the First Nations, and like you'd have people of Indian background saying like, well, we can make it in Canada. We don't go on welfare. We can do well. Like, well, why are these people like getting special privileges? And then not acknowledging, like the histories that are at work there, and also not acknowledging shared struggles. So I mean that's a basic kind of background. And in the story I talk about like this very, I think, telling anecdote, which is about one of my cousins, where like when I was growing up, we all ate Kentucky Fried Chicken all the time. That was like that and McDonald's were a family staple. We were like an immigrant family, right. And so we would go on regular runs to KFC, and we were going into like a parking lot once, and we saw like a Black family coming out, and my cousin said, "Boy, those Black people sure love fried chicken."
In contrast to you guys.
In contrast to us, exactly. Like we're eating fried, we're actually going to the same place. Like,
right.
and I think it's a particular type of racism where it's not the racism of them sort of master and slave. It's the racism of the sibling rivalry. It's the racism of people who are, right. I don't want to be seen to be the same as you, even though we might have some similarities.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and then how those things are exploited within the context of the conservative movement specifically. You actually mentioned that some of your relatives and community are very explicitly anti-racist, and I want to circle back to that at some point because that's a very different history and linkage there. That's really, I think, really important to mention when we have this conversation. So we will get to that, but let's look at Dinesh D'souza because you do a couple of things in looking at his biography and looking at his history that I think are really important, and I think which I want you to elaborate on. And number one, which I think really bears repeating, that he is almost like the kind of conservative intellectual equivalent in some ways of someone like Sarah Palin, in the sense that
Yes.
maybe at this point, a lot of people would say, oh, well, he doesn't represent the conservative movement. He's kind of on the fringe. We don't really like him anymore. He doesn't represent us. This guy was highly respected within not only really the conservative movement, but really this is someone who wrote incredibly reactionary books that were reviewed by the New York Times, that were, really thought worthy of public debate. And really, with the exception of this kind of juvenile sort of hunt for retweets that he's devolved into, there's nothing really different on the substance. So that's one thing that's very important. The other thing is you talk specifically about his mentor at Dartmouth, and this sort of line of colonial subject writing, basically, that he fits into. Now, that's a lot, but I think both of those themes are really important. I'd love you to get into both of them and how it illustrates the bigger picture you're getting at.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think right now, D'Souza is considered to be a clown, like not just by like liberals and leftists, but by like a lot of conservatives. But I think we have to actually step back and look at the history, because when he emerged in the early 1980s, he was like seen as like the future of conservatism. Right. He was like the next William F. Buckley, the next George Will, right? He was a grad. Came out of Dartmouth, and he was an editor at the Dartmouth Review, which we'll go back to, but he started publishing at National Review. But by the late 1980s, he was like publishing, not just there, but like he had a big cover story in the Atlantic Monthly on political correctness. He was writing in the New Republic. He was writing in the American Scholar. Like he was treated as someone, and he was like a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, right, which is supposedly a haven for like these great minds. And later he was at the Hoover Institute. So he was treated as a very serious kind of intellectual, and which is a bit odd, because I think like the sort of juvenile racism that we see now was always in his work, right? If you go back to the Dartmouth Review, the student paper that he edited, like one of the things he put in the paper was this like attack on affirmative action that was written in like Amos and Andy talk, like, we sure is happy to be in Dartmouth. That's like, so that's like right from the start. And another thing
so maybe he really was the next William F. Buckley. No, I'm cheap shot. Okay,
well,
go ahead. So he, and I think that one of the things about him that made him appealing was, and not just him, but like he was able to put more benign face on sort of like reactionary racial ideas, to say like, well, this guy's against political correctness, and he's like an immigrant from India, This guy's against affirmative action, and he thinks like, we should rescind the Civil Rights Act, which is, what D'Souza advocated. But, like he's a more like visibly appealing figure for putting forth those ideas than someone like Charles Murray, who's, whiter than cocaine and, like burned a cross when he was a young man, right? Like, so the youthful excess.
I think that's a big part of,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
But to go back to his Dartmouth Review thing, one of the academic mentor at Dartmouth who helped create the Dartmouth Review, was created in his living room, is a fellow named Jeffrey Hart, who's was a National Review editor and was an English professor, and he was like a pretty reactionary guy. He's kind of changed politically over time, but in the context of the 1970s and 80s, there's two things I'll point out to. One is that he reviewed this novel called The Camp of Saints by French writer Jean Rispal, and that's like an incredible novel. It's about like these sort of this flotilla of refugees that are floating into from India to France, and that are threatening French civilization. And the heroes in the novel are these like old guard French aristocrats who like shoot these immigrants, right? And the villains are all these like liberals who like want to allow like massive refugees into France. And Hart reviewed this novel and praised it to the stars. He compared it to like James Joyce, Stravinsky, D.H. Lawrence. And then what he wrote was that this novel brings readers to the surprising conclusion that killing 1 million or so starving refugees from India would be a supreme act of individual sanity and cultural health. And
Wow.
the Jean Rispal is to genocide what D.H. Lawrence is to sex.
Oh my God.
So
It sounds
so,
like,
I mean,
as
this is
you
like
describe it, I mean, it's just it's so obscene. And the novel sounds almost like, and maybe I'm reaching, but one of my favorite movies is the Buñuel, is the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie. It sounds almost like the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie mixed with like, the platform of the National Front or something. It's just like this really grotesque hybrid of a kind of aristocratic indulgence, murder and racism. And this is and this guy was saying, Go ahead.
Exactly, and then held up as a model, right?
Right.
Like, so it's kind of curious that Hart really took to D'Souza and thought, like, he helped D'Souza when D'Souza was still an undergraduate to publish in National Review, and then Hart was always praising D'Souza to the sky. So, I was just saying about Jeffrey Hart. I mean, it seems like a paradox that a guy who would, celebrate an openly racist, genocidal novel against Indian refugees would, become the mentor of a young man who's an immigrant from Mumbai, India. Mm-hmm. But actually, it's not so paradoxical, because in the Raspal novel itself, and Hart points this out, there's actually like a good Indian. There's a very dark-skinned Indian who moves to France, assimilates to French culture, and is on the side of the people who want to keep the refugees out, right?
Right.
So there's this idea that, like, I term this as sort of like the ethnic sidekick, right?
Yep.
It's like, the Lone Ranger has Tonto, the Green Hornet has Kato, Will Eisner's The Spirit had Ebony White, like you always have like the white hero who has like the Gunga Din, right? It's Kipling's idea of Gunga Din, like, like this is like the loyal servant who helps support the empire. Right. And I mean, it's hard not to see like D'Souza as like fulfilling that kind of role, because he basically supported everything that Jeffrey Hart did in the 70s and 80s. Became a very reactionary National Review conservative, but was able to put, as I said, like the face to it that makes it more like palatable, or less like obviously a defense of white privilege.
Right.
And,
so this is really important, and I want to get, actually, because you also talk about James Burnham, who's kind of the the real ultimate guru of a lot of this, and there's even more to pick apart with this sort of like the colonial assimilation and the role in enforcing colonial values and of course, but I think that what you're pointing out that's so important about your piece is I think that there's a broad kind of recognition that those that would deny that there is white privilege or there is systemic racism, or those that are pushing this far right agenda, obviously from a PR perspective, it is preferable to have black and brown faces to advance those policies. And I would also add that knowing some people who are involved in pretty conservative politics, on that sort of very, there are these different scales when we discuss racism, obviously, and what it sometimes gets really reduced to are like, literally, are you a personally sort of hateful person of people from other backgrounds? And they in fact are not. They might actually, they might be in marriages to people who are outside of their ethnic group or something like that. So in that sense, they probably feel more comfortable with that as well. But I think what you're pointing out is it's not just a desire for different faces, and it's not just a way of blanketing over those differences. It's a very, very specific role. It's the reaffirmation role. It's not even a conservative, like, I believe in small government or whatever, but I still accept that racism is a very real thing, or I still am not entirely enrolled in this whole system or game or mythology that we live in. You have to really reaffirm it and rearticulate it. And, it made me think, and I want you to touch on this too, that is a real, there's the racism that's targeted at Obama, but every time, we talk about this nonsense, this craziness about him being an anti-colonialist and all, as if somehow America, I mean, of course, our founding was anti-colonialist, obviously. A lot of people pointed that out. But that every time Obama acknowledges, even in the softest terms, a flaw in America or Christianity or whatever, that is not only an innate problem, it's sort of doubly dangerous because he is not playing that role that basically educated members of the colonial subject populations better play.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that Obama, I mean, from my point of view, is a pretty centrist figure, but
Totally.
he seems totally threatening to these reactionaries because even the slightest acknowledgement that there's a problem is a threat to the system, and what you need is someone like D'Souza who will affirm the goodness of the system, and I mean beyond the Obama stuff, like D'Souza does, go into justifying the wars against the Native Indians, saying slavery was it helped the blacks because it gave them economic advantage, and they were treated well because they were valued as property, and so he's providing exactly that justification. I think one way to think about this is in terms of which audience are you addressing, right? Because I think that there is a genuine African American conservatism that's very authentic, but because it comes from the black community and it's addressed to the black community. I mean, I'm talking about people like Booker T. Washington or even like Marcus Garvey, who can be seen as both radical and conservative. But I mean,
Louis Farrakhan, I think, is very much in that tradition.
Because it's an ideology of self-help, right? It's the white man will never do anything for us. Like liberalism is a fraud. We got to just work on be self-reliant and work for ourselves, and that's a genuine conservative strain in the black community, and there are parallels among Asians and other immigrant groups.
Right.
But that's all addressed internally to the community, right? Like Farrakhan is talking to other black people. But if you take that same message and you're addressing it to a white audience, it becomes something very different. It becomes not self-help. It becomes a way of justifying the status quo. And I think that that's what troubles me about these sort of black conservatives and Asian conservatives and non-white conservatives. If they were just addressing their own community, that would be one thing. I mean, someone like Ben Carson maybe shows the trajectory, right? Because I think initially was coming out of that black conservative tradition of self-help, but then once it becomes but once you're addressing CPAC, right? Once you're addressing a nearly all-white Republican audience and saying blacks got to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, it becomes a very different message.
Right. Exactly. And just to complete the thought on this role specifically, you talked. I think it was Burnham who talked about how some of the best fighters for the British Empire were Gurkhas, I believe. And
Gurkhas and Sikhs, which was very funny.
Do you have a Sikh background?
I'm Sikh. My family is Sikh, so that really resonated to me. I can become the ethnic sidekick. and Burnham specifically said, the greatest moment was when you have these British officers leading these black and brown troops, and they could accomplish great things. And he lamented we're this is the terrible thing about the decolonization. We're going to lose all these wonderful cannon fodder. And so it's a very so I mean for me, I mean the saddest thing about D'Souza is even though it's been very lucrative, he's made he's become wealthy doing this stuff, but I mean how humiliating is it to be Tonto? How humiliating is it to be Cato, right?
Well, if you were Dinesh D'Souza, and if I was you, I would tweet that at him. That's a pretty provocative tweet. But before we wrap this up, I do want to touch on this other tradition because I think it's very important, and I think just as what I love about your perspective is you've really showed almost that someone like D'Souza, and that obviously he's just an example. There's many others, is almost the kind of that's the public intellectual or pundit equivalent of those soldiers, of those colonialist subjects in the conservative mind, and that's just It adds a lot to our understanding of this. But on the other hand, we know that there's these global connections and these alliances, and these histories go in a different direction. And we know the kind of really deep connection. It wasn't just that, Martin Luther King Jr. read, Gandhi. He was really a student and a visitor to India, and the cross sections between those two cultures and movements are very, very close. I think closer than people realize. Malcolm X, was assassinated. The anniversary of his assassination was this past weekend. Was not only a great leader that actually moved in between those leftist traditions and very much the black conservative tradition. Really, by the time he was assassinated, was a global anti-colonialist, as well as and then of course the Islamic and Islamophobia debate is implicated by that. So, what's this other tradition that we can draw on?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it has like really deep roots, and going back. Even like well back into the 19th century like abolitionists working with Irish rebel leaders, like Frederick Douglass went to like Ireland and saw a great commonality between the Irish struggle for independence and the struggle against slavery. And I think the person who really articulated this best was W.E.B. Du Bois, like a Titanic intellectual in the early 20th century who said, the color line is global, right? Like that there's a global color line, and that's the problem of the 20th century. And Du Bois, in all his work, really saw commonality between, the struggles for independence in Africa, in Asia, and the struggle for decolonization in America. And the two things really went hand in hand, and in very complicated ways. I mean, I think one reason why the civil rights movement was able to take off in the 1950s was that the Eisenhower and the other Cold Warriors realized that, if Africa becomes independent, and Asia becomes independent, we can't have, it'll look terrible to have Jim Crow here.
Those are votes at the UN.
Yeah, the votes in the UN, but also it's a huge propaganda victory for the Soviet Union that they can point to. That America is so racist and segregated. So the struggles have gone hand in hand, and this is the greatest irony, because the Dinesh D'Souza is a beneficiary of the civil rights movement in a very specific way, which is that prior to 1965, the American immigration was hugely racist, had a quota system. You could, basically only allow a couple of hundred people from India into America at a time, right? Mm-hmm. And the immigration system was favored towards Northern Europeans, right? Not just Europeans in general. If you're Italian, you're out of luck. You have to be Swedish. So the
real Europeans, we're not messing around here.
That's right, blonder than blonde,
That's right.
And but that changed because of pressure from the civil rights movement. Because as you were getting the Civil Rights Act, you had people looking at the immigration system saying, we can't have civil rights and have a racist immigration system. And the person who pushed that forward was Ted Kennedy. Yep. And so so Dinesh D'Souza, I honestly don't think he would have been allowed to immigrate to America if it weren't for the civil rights movement.
So we really needed to rethink the civil rights movement.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think that's the ultimate. It's the ultimate irony, and that it's exactly. I think that the way it's come is you still have a huge amount of hierarchy in America. You have a perceived hierarchy of races. Right. And, African Americans are, near the bottom of that ladder. And for someone like D'Souza, well, I want to rise up, so I have to step on them to climb up that ladder, Mm-hmm. It's the dark side of upward mobility and assimilation. He's assimilated to the worst aspects of American society.
Well, that's no better place to leave it. I hope Rudy Giuliani hears this. He'll have an aneurysm. Jeet Heer, Canadian journalist, and author of this recent piece in the New Republic called "How to Make It in Conservative America If You're Not White." I guess it's either a critique or an instruction manual. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.